Welcome to U of R TV. The Keystone XL pipeline has been making headlines again recently. After 7 years in deliberation, President Obama has rejected the expansion project. Today I have two guests with me to discuss the details of the pipeline and why it took 7 years to arrive at a decision. Jasmine from the Canadian National Energy Board and Mackenzie of TransCanada. To start things off, I would like to ask Mackenzie to explain what exactly the Keystone XL is.
Thanks, Chelsea. Well, the Keystone XL is an expansion pipeline that will transport oil from Alberta, Canada to the Gulf Coast of Texas. It would start in the oil sands of southern Alberta and travel down throughout the United States until connection with the existing Keystone pipeline in Nebraska.
And why is this expansion important?
Essentially because of the economic growth it would create. The construction phase would last 2 years, creating nearly 40,000 jobs and injecting $3.4 billion into the U.S. economy. Once completed, the project will continue to provide jobs while simultaneously lowering oil prices throughout the U.S. It's a big deal.
So why do people oppose this project? Jasmine?
Well, our analysis of this project makes it very clear that this pipeline is not in our national interest. It poses several risks to our water supply, soil, and wildlife. Numerous aspects of this pipeline pose a risk to the environment, and the economic growth is just not substantial enough to outweigh this. Between increased gas house emission, disturbance of land, and the possibility of a spill, the risk is far too great. Not to mention the completed pipeline will only create 35 new permanent jobs.
Mackenzie?
That's 35 new jobs on the pipeline itself, though. The number fails to account for the hundreds of jobs created at refineries in order to accommodate for the increased crude oil inputs. This pipeline will provide an additional 830,000 barrels of crude per day to the refineries on the Gulf Coast.
What about the environmental risks, like gas emissions, as Jasmine mentioned?
Reports from the U.S. State Department show that obtaining oil through this pipeline does not significantly affect emissions. It actually is far better to transport it through the proposed pipeline than it is via rail or overseas, which together produce 40% more emissions than the pipeline. Additionally, a pipeline of this nature is likely to spill fewer gallons of oil than the rail or tanker methods. The Keystone XL is predicted to spill 518 barrels of oil annually, while the rail and tanker systems would result in 1,227 barrels spilled per year. Extracting oil from the tar sands does require more energy than conventional oil, but the entire process from well to wheels results in 17% increase in the emissions. As a company, TransCanada has established many sites of renewable energy, both hydroelectric and wind. These produce 3,600 megawatts, that's 7 times the requirements of the XL pipeline pumps, meaning that the pipeline essentially in itself is emission-free.
Well, even if the transportation is more efficient, the overall effects of the tar sands is far too great. A study by Erickson and Lazarus has shown that State Department's estimate of an additional up to 27 million tons of greenhouse gas emissions is actually grossly underestimated. This number fails to consider how the reduced oil prices would increase consumption and demand. If the demand does increase, as is expected, the oil sand production will also increase. You mentioned a reduce in the risk of oil spills, though it seems every major pipeline company, including Enbridge and Exxon, has also proposed the same precautions before implementing each of their pipelines which have ruptured. ExxonMobil's Pegasus pipeline, buried for more than 6 decades, quietly propelling oil between Texas and Illinois before it ruptured on March 29. In 2010, there was a spill in Michigan in which 843,000 gallons of oil, that's equivalent to 20,000 barrels, were spilled, contaminating 40 miles of the Kalamazoo River.
What were the consequences of this particular spill, and how long have the consequences lasted?
Well, Chelsea, to start, the spill took 17 hours to be stopped because the alarm system was misread. The result, the most costly onshore spill in the history of US, costing more than $1.2 billion in cleanup costs. Aside from that, the effects were widespread and lasting. Is not much known about tar sand. Crude is much different chemically than conventional crude. It's a lot heavier and must be diluted using natural gas, or as was the case, benzene. Diluted bitumen is lighter than water and floats, but once spilled, from the pipeline, it does not stay in combination for long. The heavy bitumen separates from the dilutants, which are natural gas liquids like benzene, which evaporate easily. The National Resources Defense Council states that bitumen sinks to the bottom of the water and mixes with mud and makes it very difficult to remove from the system, and it negatively impacts organisms that come into contact with it. Carrying this kind of crude oil poses a huge challenge for leak detection systems. In the case of the Kalamazoo, the river had been running high and a lot of oil was washed onto the land, and the only way to get it off was to harvest all the vegetation and scrape all the soil. Only time will reveal the lasting effects.
We at TransCanada have used the last 6 years to devise multiple control features that ensure a spill of that magnitude does not happen again. It has been brought to the attention of the public that tar sand crude oil is more corrosive and damaging than regular conventional oils. While this spill in particular was unfortunate, a study released this year by consultants for the Canadian Energy Pipeline Association concluded that dilbit, which is the diluted bitumen, is no more corrosive than comparable heavy sour crudes and in many cases may be less corrosive. Researchers at the University of Washington has also come to this conclusion, stating that it does not pose an increased risk for the transmission pipeline corrosion.
Okay, well, let's say the crude oil is less corrosive. What precautions is TransCanada taking in order to ensure that no ruptures take place?
Well, the Keystone would be the first direct pipeline connecting to the advanced technologies refineries of the Texas Gulf Coast. We plan to construct pipelines at a minimum of 25 feet below the riverbeds or roadways currently at risk. One of the major concerns about the Keystone, of course, is the safety. There will be automated shut-off valves installed every 20 miles along the pipeline, as well as extra shut-off valves near water bodies and high-risk areas. This can further ensure safety by being able to shut off sections of the pipeline within minutes of detecting an issue.
Well, those precautions, though, don't reduce the likelihood of a spill to zero. Even if the spill is on land, it will make its way into the waterways or the reservoirs. Keystone is a threat to literally every biome in its path, especially those homes to endangered species. Fish suffer cardiac and respiratory problems, leading to death and decreased survival of the offspring. Bottom-dwelling organisms can survive these effects, but the toxic elements will accumulate into their systems and be transmitted to their predators, leading to the death of higher species. Birds who are unlucky enough to land in this polluted water may be covered in the oil, unable to fly, and drown. Destruction of power lines due to ruptures also poses a great risk to birds. Approximately 83 miles of the proposed project route in South Dakota and Nebraska would affect suitable American burning beetle habitat. This beetle is quite important to all ecosystems. Turn nutrients to the soil. This insect once roamed 35 states, but due to human disturbances has been disappearing since the early 1900s.
TransCanada has committed to incorporate a number of conservation measures, including putting up objects designed to make lines more visible to the flying birds. In regards to the American beetle, we have made an effort to conserve the population by collecting and moving more than 2,000 away from the pipeline.
And what kind of effects would a spill have on land opposed to in a body of water?
Well, Chelsea, the most substantial effect will be on the soil. Oil pollution degrades the soil quality tremendously by increasing the pH and lowers the availability of phosphorus. Also, even without a spill, potential impacts to soil resources in other areas associated with construction or operation of the proposed project and connected actions could include soil erosion, landslides, loss of topsoil, soil compaction, an increase in the proportion of large rocks in the topsoil, soil mixing, soil contamination, and it just reduces the productivity of vegetation or crops. Construction could also result in damage to existing tile drainage systems, irrigation systems.
To minimize these impacts, Keystone would, if permitted, put in place procedures for construction and operation that are designed to reduce the likelihood and severity of proposed project impacts to the soils and sediments, including topsoil segregation methods, and to mitigate impacts to the extent practicable. After construction, areas of erosion or settling would be monitored.
Well, that's all the time we have for today. Thanks for my guests for informing us more on the topic here. Pay attention to the future elections in the US as Obama's term is almost up and this pipeline may rally to be built once more.